So I've been watching so many different videos for the Tamron 70-180mm lens, and there's this one thing that's so important about this lens that makes it so much better than the other 70-200mm lens that people just gloss over. So we're going to talk about that in this video. Tamron does not get the praise they deserve, honestly. Like, look at this right here. Look at this picture. We got a 70-180mm lens and a 28-75mm lens. Can you guess which one's which? I mean, obviously this is the 70-180mm, but just look at this. Look at the difference between these two lenses. It's insane. So if you haven't watched my channel, you know that I've been on a journey to find the perfect 70-200mm lens for my Sony camera. But before I got this lens, I got the Sigma 70-200mm for Canon, and I adopted that to Sony using the MC11 adapter, and that gave me okay results in shooting photos, but for video it was just unusable with autofocus. So reluctantly I bought the 70-180mm Tamron version of the lens besides the Sony GM lens, which is $2,600, and this lens is only $1,200. So far I used it on 1 gig so far, and this lens has been amazing, and especially if you pair it up with the Tamron 2075 lens, this lens is quite amazing. So there are a couple of negatives with this lens that we're going to talk about then, so make sure to watch the whole video because we're going to be going over pictures, we're going to be talking about the negatives and the positives of this lens, but honestly this is the best 70-200mm lens you can get for your Sony camera, depending on what kind of shooter you are. If you're a Sony shooter like me, if you want to shoot with a 70-200 f2.8 lens, which is a very important range depending on what kind of shooter you are, if you're doing portraits, if you're doing events, weddings, it's a lens that's used all the time and you need a good performing one. So you have 3 options if you want to get a lens like that, which is you can do something like what I did, which is I get the Sigma 70-200 f2.8 and then adapt it to the Sony camera using the MC11 adapter. But honestly, after going through that, I wouldn't really recommend it. For video, I use autofocus a lot when I'm shooting events because, you know, there's things that are constantly moving, you know, people are running around and you're holding the camera and you have to like make sure you frame it right, and just letting the camera do the autofocus is a lot easier. So for that reason, I wouldn't recommend going through with the adapted options because you just don't get the right performance. Even for photo, there's some, it works usually quite fine, but there are sometimes it just haunts a lot. Which means you only have 2 options really, which is getting either the Tamron 2.8 version, which is $1,200, or going with the Sony version, that's $2,600. And since the Sony version is expensive, you must think that, oh, Sony version is a lot better, right? And the thing is that it's different. It's just that I think overall the Tamron version is a better lens than the Sony version. First of all, at shooting at f2.8, this lens is actually sharper than the Sony GM version, surprisingly. You know, this is less than half the cost, but it's a sharper lens. And also, this lens is just so much lighter. Like, look at this thing. I mean, just look at this. This thing is so small. It's light. And I watched a lot of reviews on this lens before I bought it, and everyone was like, oh, this is made out of cheap plastic. No, this is like high quality plastic. I mean, it is plasticky, but it feels really nice on your hand. I like it better than the metal ones, actually, because this thing it's just so light. And things that when you're shooting with a full frame camera, you get these giant lenses that are heavy, and then, you know, you end up like not bringing the lenses. That's why I have this lens in the back also, is because this is the Sigma 150-600mm lens, and honestly this is like around the size with the Sigma 70-200mm lenses. And if we compare it to, you know, this lens is literally double the size. And things that for shooting wildlife and stuff, I love shooting with this lens, but a lot of times I end up not bringing it because of how big and heavy this is. Just like holding this lens just right now is like hurting my arms. It feels like it's gonna fall off. I'm not gonna have an arm, and this is the hand I use to like do stuff to myself. Alright, so the first positive we're going to talk about is how small and light this lens is, which is a huge positive because, again, a lot of these 70-200mm lenses are so big and large that you end up not bringing with you if you're shooting it as a hobby. But even if you're shooting it professionally, you know, if you're shooting weddings or if you're shooting an event or if you're shooting wildlife, you're going to be out there for hours. Like, for example, when I was shooting the birthday party a couple of days ago, you know, I went there around 7 p.m. and I got out at 12:30 a.m. So I shot for 5.5 hours there while holding this lens, and my arms didn't get that much tired. I mean, I did get tired because I was shooting for over 5 hours. But if I was shooting with a lens that was twice the size and weight of this, which is what the other lenses are, then then I would have been even more tired. So it's important to keep those things in mind. So the size and weight for this lens is just amazing. People have been praising the new Canon RF 72-200mm lens because of how small and light that lens is. But guess what? This lens is actually smaller and lighter than that lens. But also the Canon version has optical image stabilization, while this lens don't. We're going to talk more about that later in the video. Another important thing about the size of this lens is that since it is so small, you can actually fit this in your pocket or your belt. For example, when I'm shooting events, I like to wear a utility belt while I'm shooting it so that I could easily put like my lens caps and everything. And I'll also store 2 lenses on there. Now, if I had a giant 7200mm lens like the Sony version or the Sigma version, then I won't be able to fit those lenses on my belt. But since this lens is so small, I can easily do that. Also in the comment section, let me know if you want to hear what gears I use while I'm shooting events. So the second thing we're going to talk about is the thread size of this lens. Now this lens has 67mm thread size, which is very important because a lot of Sony lenses have 67mm thread size. Like right now I'm shooting with the Sigma 35mm f1.4 that has a 67mm thread size. The Tamron 20-75mm has a 67mm thread size, which means that if you have any filters, then you can just use it on all of these lenses without having to, adapt it. But another important thing that people don't really keep in mind is that, for example, when I was shooting the birthday party, I was shooting with both of these lenses on the same camera body. So I was constantly swapping between them. And when I was swapping, if you normally have 2 lenses with different thread size, then you cannot put the same cap on them. But since I could do it on the same one while I was shooting with this lens, and I need to swap out to the 20-75mm, then what I would do is I would just, take this off the camera and then just grab the Tamron version real quick, and then I would just pop this off, not throw it on the table. I would pop it back onto the other lens and then put this on my belt, and then boom, just put this back on. So you can easily hot swap between these 2 lenses while you're shooting. Alright, now the third and the final thing that's really important about this lens that people just don't talk about as much. I know people mention in their reviews, but they just don't talk about how important this is for professionals. Is that this lens, even though it's a 7200mm lens, which just means it's going to be a telephoto lens, this lens is actually also a macro lens. Now again, people mention that. They're like, oh, you can do some macro photography with this lens if you want, but that's a big deal. Because if you're an event shooter, or especially if you're a wedding shooter, guess what? You're going to be taking portraits of people with this lens, which is what it's meant to do. But now you can also use this lens to take pictures of like the wedding ring, the setting, the menus, When you're taking those things, you usually use a macro lens. Like one I got it right here, which I usually use this Canon 100mm f2.8. You can get this lens for pretty cheap. I got it for around $200 and it works great. But guess what? Now I don't need this lens when I'm shooting events or weddings, because this lens pretty much does it for you. Does it do it as well as this lens? I mean, it does a good enough job. This lens still gets you a little bit closer, but honestly, here's some side-by-side pictures of how close you can get with this lens compared to this one. And honestly, you can actually get closer with this lens, but since this is a 100mm macro lens, and this can only do macro at 70mm, then this lens actually ends up being closer. Which is interesting how they did macro with this lens, is that you can only do macro if you're at 70mm and you're on manual focus. If you're on autofocus, it'll say you can only get up to like 0.6mm. But then when you swap over to manual focus, then you can go up to 0.3 and you can get really close up to it, like right up to your subject. Now there are a couple of big negatives with this lens, and I don't think these negatives are going to make this worse than the Sony version. It's just going to make it different. So depending on what kind of shooter you are, you might want to spend a little extra, $1,400 more and go with the Sony version. So if you're a wildlife or sports shooter, I don't think this is the lens for you. I think you'd be better off getting the Sony version, because this lens currently doesn't have any teleconverters for it, which means that you're stuck with the 70-180mm focal length. Which is a bummer, because this would have been an amazing wildlife lens, because it is so small, which means that you could just put a 2x teleconverter on this and get a 360mm focal length on such a small package. But unfortunately, there are no teleconverters out for it right now. So if you're someone that wants to get a 7200mm and then just teleconverters, so you have a small compact setup that can shoot really far. But I heard some people say that, oh, there might be some coming up in the future. But then I also heard that because of the flange distance that you can't put a teleconverter on it. But then some people are like, oh, it's perfect for doing teleconverter. So I don't know. Currently there are no teleconverters for it right now, but hopefully in the future Sigma will come up with one. The second bummer is going to be that there's no image stabilization on this lens compared to the Sony version, which is quite a bummer, especially if you're shooting with a non-stabilized body like the A6000 cameras, or like me, if you're shooting with a Sony FS5, which doesn't have any stabilization. But honestly, with shooting with this lens, I didn't have any problems with stabilization. But honestly, the only time that I did wish that this lens did have image stabilization was if I'm trying to shoot at those lower shutter speeds while I'm taking pictures. Then, you know, if I'm shooting at like 1/50th of a second or something while I'm at 180 millimeters, then it just doesn't compensate enough for it, even if you're shooting with a, you know, stabilized body like the A7R III that I'm shooting this with right now. So I think even for video, the image stabilization is fine. And again, if I'm shooting events or whatever, I'm usually either on a tripod or a monopod, so the stabilization I usually turn off anyways. But depending on what kind of shooter you are, you know, if you're shooting handheld, then the image stabilization would have been nice on the lens. But I'm guessing they did that just to keep the lens even lighter and cheaper. But I would like to have some image stabilization on this lens, even if it made it bigger and a little bit more expensive. Now, third thing that kind of is a bummer with this lens is that there isn't any buttons, and there's only like one switch on it. There are no manual focus switches or buttons. There's only one lock right here. That's only if you have your lens at 70 millimeters, then you can lock it. If you're at 180 millimeters and you want to lock it, you can't do that. You can only do it at 70 millimeters to lock it. But I'm guessing that is so that if you're doing macro photography, that you can just lock it and be able to do it. But if you do get up to 70 millimeters by accident, like if you bump into it or whatever, it does go out of that macro shooting mode. So it is cool that it does have the lock. And also if you just put it in your bag, you don't want to move around, then it's good to have that lock on there. But I wish there was a manual focus switch on this lens. But again, if you want to shoot macro with this lens, you need to be in manual focus. So to go into manual focus, then you have to go into your camera settings and then change to manual focus. Besides just having a switch right here, would have been a lot easier, and I wish Tamron did that. Now the final thing that's wrong with this lens that I hate when lens companies do this, and Tamron does this with all their lenses, is that the focus wheel is by wire only, which means that you get this really dumb focusing system that's completely unreliable, and like depending on how fast you go, it like changes the speed the focus changes. Like it doesn't make any sense. It's terrible for taking pictures, especially if you're doing macro photography with this lens. If you just want to make like a small little adjustment, it doesn't do anything, so you have to go faster, but then it just goes all the way to the back. Like, it's insane. Like, just give us a proper focusing wheel. And for video also, if you want to do, you know, rack focusing, where you want to focus on the front subject first and you want to focus back and you want to know exactly how much to go, you can't do that with this focusing wheel, really. You can do it, but it's just a pain in the ass. And I just don't understand why these lens companies do it. I'm guessing it's just cheaper to do it this way, where you don't actually have to put like a proper lens wheel to it, where you know the proper hard stops and everything, or just have to, you know, properly judge the distance. But I don't know, they just give us this wheel. I'm so frustrated I can't even talk right now. I don't know, Tamron should go to jail and like get shot by the musketeers for doing this stuff. I don't know why they do it. That's one of the reasons why I kind of consider waiting for Sigma to come out with their own version, because Sigma actually gives you a proper focusing wheel. If you look at the Sigma version right here, you know, when you focus with it, you can see exactly how much you're focusing. Like, again, if you're doing focus tracking, you can be like, oh, I want to be right here for the front person, and then when I go back, I'll just bring it here, you know. It makes life so much easier for videography. And honestly, if you're a serious videographer, you only want a 7200mm lens to use it for video, honestly, you'll be better off getting the Canon EF version. That's Sigma, the Sigma 7200mm for Canon EF version, and then just adapting it to your Sony and just using manual focus. If you just want to use manual focus, definitely get the Sigma version. It just works a lot better. I don't like this wire system. I don't know why companies do it, but they do. But again, that's going to be it for the video, guys. I love this lens, and I'm completely happy with it. And again, if you're a shooter like me, if you shoot events, if you shoot weddings, if you shoot portraits, definitely get this lens. But if you're a wildlife shooter or you shoot sports, then you're going to be better off getting the Sony version because you can use teleconverters with it. And you're also going to get an optical image stabilization that's going to help a lot with it. And if you're a serious videographer and you're going to only use manual focus, then get the Sigma version of this lens. Another reason to get a Sigma version if you're a cinematographer is that since it's going to be an EF mount, you're going to be able to adapt it to any cinema cameras, such as the Red cameras, the Ursa Minis, the Lexus. So it's going to give you more flexibility with cinema cameras. But that's going to be it for our journey to find the perfect 7200mm lens. And the next lens, I'm thinking of getting the super wide version because there's a lot of different lenses that you can get. Like you can get the Sony 12 to 24mm f2.8. That's $3,000. That sounds great. There's also the Sigma 14 to 24mm, that's around I think $1,500, so that lens also sounds pretty great. There's the Tamron 72 28mm, which sounds kind of gross because it's not too wide, it doesn't zoom in that much, so it's in that awkward range, but it does have the same filter size, and also that lens is quite cheaper than the other ones, so around like $899. So I don't know, there's bunch of different lenses that I'm considering buying, so make sure to subscribe to the channel to see my adventure with it. And I do a lot of different videos, so make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.